Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another lecture in psychology. Today, I want to address what we refer to as developmental psychology, developing through the lifespan. We go through stages clearly as we begin life. Most of us started life in one of our mother's fallopian tubes, and we go through various stages until we reach the end. And so I want to talk about some of the things psychology has found. Your chapter is long and has quite a lot of information, so the difficulty in my lecture is I can't cover all the information without taking 3 hours, and I don't think you want that in a lecture. So I want to try and touch on the most important aspects in developmental psychology, what you absolutely need to know. Now, there are three big issues in developmental psychology that we want to just introduce our topic with. The first, clearly, all of us are familiar with, the old nature versus nurture question. Are we a product of our genetic inheritance from our mother and father, the 23 chromosomes, or pairs of chromosomes that we get, 23 from our mother and 23 from our father? Or is it more important how we are raised, what our family life is like, and what our school life and culture and so on and so forth? The nature versus nurture issue has been around for, we certainly know upwards of 2,600 years, because Plato and Aristotle took opposite sides of this issue. The interesting thing about the nature-nurture question is that in some ways that question has been solved, or at least substantially addressed, by the emerging field of epigenetics. If you want to know more about epigenetics, I would just suggest you go to Google and search it. But it's just the idea that we used to think that genetics was fixed and that the environment influenced how we express those genetics. But we now know through epigenetics that our biology is not fixed. In fact, the chromosomes we have and the 25,000 plus or minus gene pairs that we have on those 23 chromosomes do change in response to environment. There are switches that are turned on and off by our environment. And so nature versus nurture is really an artificial question. Which is it? Yes, both. A second issue, which you may not be as familiar with, is the change versus stability question. And this issue in developmental psychology is just, do we basically remain stable over time with some developmental changes, clearly the ability to walk and adolescence and so on and so forth, or are we constantly changing over time? To put it another way, let's say you were to come back for your 20th year reunion, your high school reunion. Would the people you went to high school with be basically the same in terms of their personality, or would you expect that they had changed quite a lot? So the change versus stability question, again, the jury's out with regard to that. But the best way I could say it is that with regard to our personalities themselves, there's a stability that seems to run through all the developmental ages. So if you're a happy baby, you're probably going to be a happy school-age child, and you're probably going to be a happy teenager, and you're probably going to be a happy adult. If you're basically a sociopath in the making, we can look at things that behaviors that in childhood that would probably predict that in adulthood. So there's a basic stability. Now clearly there's so much change, and we could have a discussion at some point between all of us as to how you've changed, for instance, during high school or during your college years or whatever it is. It is an important issue in developmental psychology. A third one has to do with continuity versus stages. And again, the best way to describe this is development more like a dimmer switch? We've all seen dimmer switches or used dimmer switches in which you can gradually turn on a light, so gradually. And presumably you could do it so slowly that you wouldn't even know the light was going on. Or, on the other hand, does development tend to go into stages in which one stage ends, another begins, and there are clear leaps in developmental skills. As you'll see with this lecture and with your reading in this chapter, psychologists love the idea of stages. So Freud has his 5 stages, and Piaget has his 4 stages, and Erikson has his 8 stages, and Kohlberg has his 6 stages. The question here is development relatively continuous, or does it go in bursts? And again, the answer to that is yes, probably both. Again, the jury's still out on this. But chances are for most of us, and psychology would agree with this, that most development is incremental, extremely incremental, in which there is a continuity between 1 minute, 1 day, 1 month to the next. There are times when there are big changes, there are big leaps, there are big significant differences that happen. And again, these can happen because of a growth spurt. These can happen because near-death experience changes the way you see everything. So like the other 3, it's both, but again, it's still an important issue to consider in developmental psychology. Now, as we, let's start at the beginning, because as we study developmental psychology, some people are under the illusion that psychologically speaking, birth is the beginning of development. But we could make the argument that by the time you're born, huge, very important things have already happened in development. And in fact, I would make the argument that before we're even born, the prenatal period is probably the most important period of development for our entire lives. If I could put it another way, if certain things don't happen or certain things do happen while we're in the womb of our mothers, those influences a lot of times are not reversible and will have lifelong consequences one way or the other. Now, we all begin life, again, as I said before, most of us began life in the left or right fallopian tube of our mother. As you surely know by now, that your father contributed sperm to your development, and in the head of that sperm were 23 chromosomes. Your mother contributed an ovum. We call this the egg. I don't really like the term egg, but the technical term would be ovum, O-V-U-M. And in that ovum were the 23 chromosomes. And within a day or so after your mom and dad had sex, sorry, it does happen, you wouldn't be here because of it, the sperm and ovum eventually, in most cases, connect. And when they fuse together, the first stage of life after conception, or after we call fertilization technically, is called the zygotic stage. And again, those two sets of chromosomes fuse together and entwine with each other, and gives us the blueprint for not just our hair color and eye color and skin color and height and weight and so on and so forth, but really lays down the paradigmatic foundation of just about every attribute you can imagine that relates to human beings. Athletic ability and music ability, and whether you'll basically be a happy person, an unhappy person, your predispositions to schizophrenia and cancer and heart disease and stroke, to name some negative ones here. So in the beginning, fertilization takes place, and then we are a zygote for about 2 weeks. We call this first stage the zygotic stage, and basically in this stage, we want to say that technically pregnancy hasn't begun. You are an organism. You were an organism, a zygotic organism floating down the fallopian tube toward the uterus. And this journey, shall we say, takes about 10 to 12 to 14 days. We just call it an even 2 weeks. And so we say the first 2 weeks of pregnancy are the zygotic stage. And during this stage, you're not attached to your mother. Your mother doesn't, we couldn't give you a pregnancy test, a urine or blood test, and tell if she was pregnant, because That happens in the next stage, the embryonic stage. But during this first zygotic stage, that one-celled organism that we began with splits into 2 cells, and then splits into 4, and then 8, and 16, and 32, and 64, and so on and so forth. The zygote doesn't get any bigger. Every time there's a split, the cells are half as big as the other splits. So the zygote is not just floating and doing nothing, but is doing a lot of work. Now, just a couple comments here. If someone is an identical twin, what happens when that zygote splits, let's say from 4 cells to 8, in some rare cases, that split, instead of just splitting to 8 cells, will split into 2 different 4-celled human beings. So that's what we call identical twins. When we have fraternal twins, that doesn't come from the splitting. Rather, with fraternal twins, there are 2 sperm and 2 ova that started off at the very, very beginning. And so that's why fraternal twins are no more genetically alike than brothers and sisters, whereas identical twins, because they split off from exactly the same 23 pairs of chromosomes, are way, way more similar. Now, when that zygote lands on the wall of the uterus, we have the embryonic stage. Implantation is the technical term for Houston. We have landing. That zygotic organism floats into the uterus, which will turn into the womb for the next 8.5, 9 months. And the embryonic phase is, we just call it 2 to 10 weeks. And essentially what's happening in that is everything that the child would need, all the physiological aspects of development, the growth of a brain, spinal cord, liver, heart, digestive system, skin, fingers, toes, everything develops physiologically. It's kind of interesting to me that the 2 first parts of our body that develop are the brain, because the brain is very, very important, and the second aspect that develops is the heart, because the heart needs to be pumping blood around to provide oxygen and nutrients to the embryo as it grows. Also during this time, very early on, the implantation starts the process of developing an umbilical cord and a placenta, and these 2 temporary organs are quite amazing because they take everything that the embryo and the fetus will need from the mother's bloodstream and filter it, and deliver it to the baby, and allows the baby to grow in the next 8+ months inside his or her mother's womb. The fetal stage begins at the beginning of the 2nd month. So if you do the math here, the first 2 weeks are the zygotic stage. The next 6 weeks are the embryonic stage. That adds up to 8 weeks, the first 2 months of pregnancy. And so really most of pregnancy is the fetal stage. And in the fetal stage, all of that stuff we developed, all the physiological aspects of being a human individual, continue to develop and continue to mature. And as we go through the fetal period, all of those now maturing organs are put into use, put into practice. Think about all the stuff we need to do from the first minutes after we're born. We need to breathe. We need to be able to suck on a breast to get our food. We need to be able to digest food. We need to be able to move our muscles. So the fetal stage in some ways is several things happening. One, the continuous maturation of everything that's present at the beginning of the stage. And number 2, part of this maturation is driven by the use of the various organs. So the baby in the fetal stage breathes in an amniotic fluid in their lungs, so their lungs get practice breathing. The baby swallows amniotic fluid, and the digestive system actually extracts calories. By the third trimester, 100 to 150 calories a day. And the digestive tract also practices expelling the food. The baby urinates and defecates. Now, it's all clean, and there's you don't have to worry about this, that we're swimming around in our urine. But clearly, all of the baby's organs, the baby kicks. Those of you that have been pregnant know that for a fact. But engages in what looks like repetitions in terms of pushing up and down, moving their arms, sucking their thumb. Again, the fetal stage is rich with, can I put this, experience. So even when we think about nature and nurture, we tend to think about nurture beginning in birth, but our fetal environment provides a context for development. And if your mom is happy and you're being well fed and she's, your fetal environment is going to be conducive toward healthy growth. If your mom is being abused or is traumatized or isn't eating well or is using drugs or is smoking or is exposed to radiation, hundreds of different things, your fetal nurture, is going to affect development. And indeed, it's quite amazing. At 9 weeks, we already have our thumbprints and our fingerprints. And the 4-month-old looks clearly like a baby. So many of the capabilities and capacities that babies have are present even this early on. I read the other day about a baby born at 22 weeks. Again, that is pushing the envelope at viability. But if you think about it, 22 weeks is a little past 4 months, so about 4.5 months. So clearly there's enough there for survival to take place in rare cases. And again, so many of the capabilities we have later are there. This clearly says by 6 months the fetus is able to survive outside the womb. That's, of course, in most cases. Most babies born at the 6-month level, premature babies, with some help from hospital settings and the NICU units, can survive after that. And it just goes to show you that we don't become human when we're born, or persons when we're born. Think about it. A premature baby is a fetus that's just switched places from being inside the womb to being outside the womb. And all the capabilities of a fetus, including emotional, psychological, spiritual, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to preach to you, but just as an aside, this is why certainly late-term abortions to me are exceedingly morally problematic, because and to me they're infanticide. I know I'm being a little controversial here, but to me that is infanticide, because most of us would be horrified if a premature baby was killed outside the womb, and yet late-term abortions are exactly that. It's simply a premature baby inside the mother's womb in which that child is aborted. I'm convinced of the problems of abortion because of just the evidence when you look at who and what we are during the prenatal period. Okay, my political slash sermon is done here, and so there are, of course, a huge amount of things that can go wrong in the 9 months of life. We collectively call these as teratogens or teratogens, depending on how you pronounce this, literally meaning monster makers, not very politically correct. But we can be damaged by cigarette smoke or too much alcohol, or viruses, or any number of things, radiation, stress, high levels of stress and trauma in the mom. We know cross the placental barrier and can have an adverse effect on human babies. A fascinating ongoing study is being done on the babies born to women who were in Lower Manhattan at 9/11, and clearly they are 19, 20 years old. Some of these babies, 18, 19, they wouldn't be 20 yet. And the evidence clearly shows that experiencing that one trauma in Lower Manhattan seems to have contributed to greater effect of certain problems, not just in infancy, not just in school age, but also in the teenage and now early adult years. Fetal alcohol syndrome is clearly the one teratogen which worldwide has the most potential negative impact on babies. We absolutely know that too much alcohol in pregnancy adversely affects the baby, and again, the name for that is FAS, or fetal alcohol syndrome. But even small amounts of alcohol have been shown to be associated with maybe not full-blown fetal alcohol syndrome, but particularly learning disabilities and certain other things. I think most pregnant women intuitively know they have to be extremely protective in terms of what they eat and what they drink and what they smoke, and avoiding certain behaviors that are potentially problematic for their babies. As I've already mentioned, fetuses can do quite a lot of things. They can hear. I'm always fascinated by the huge number of studies that show that fetuses listen to their mother's voice clearly and listen to music. Fetuses tend to like, and by like we can't ask them to give a thumbs up or thumbs down, but they tend to calm down to soothing music like Mozart or Brahms. They don't like rap music. They don't like hard rock. They seem to release a lot of stress hormones and jump around. Again, they certainly remember certain sounds. And there are quite a few studies. Again, you could do a Google search on this that show that fetuses, having heard a song or a story read over and over and over again, will recognize that after they're born. They certainly can develop taste preferences. We know through some interesting studies, for instance, mothers are asked to eat a banana every day, and fetuses their brains will recognize what will show a recognition pattern in terms of their brain waves when their breast milk is spiked with banana. For instance, we know that moms that eat spicy food during pregnancy, their babies are much more likely to tolerate spicy food or kind of jalapeno flavoring in the breast milk, or even so your preference for food may have been, maybe you could blame that on your mom. But clearly fetuses, particularly late third trimester fetuses, have all the capabilities of a human infant, and they're all there. It's just that their range of environmental experience is limited by being inside. Clearly, fetuses can see newborn, premature babies' vision. They can see, but there's not much to see inside the womb because it's kind of dark unless you're in bright sunlight, or unless you have a spotlight shined on the womb or the mother's abdomen. There's nothing much to see. And even if you could see there, there's no television. There's one channel, which is kind of darkness, or the wall of the uterus. So hearing, tasting, smell is not available because you need air to smell, and there's no air in the uterus. But as soon as babies are born, they can smell, they can see, they can have them, which indicates that those capabilities, all the human capabilities, all the things we study in infants, are all there. Not only before we're born, but in some cases long before we're born. Now, one generalization I want to make, this isn't on the slide in front of you, is that one huge change in our understanding of newborn infants, and even infants all the way up to age 2, we used to think they were basically blank, they were just hanging out, they weren't doing much, but we've had to drastically change our understanding of infant cognitive abilities. Infants are amazing, spectacular cognitive processors of the world. They are learning, they are observing, and we got it so spectacularly wrong because again, they seem to just lay there and not do much because, of course, they can't do much because developmentally they can't move. But when we develop the capability and technology to look inside infants' brains and to observe what's going on inside their brains and relate that with technological sophistication, then we discovered, man, they're not just laying there. They are engaging in as much cognitive learning as at any other stage of life, and in some ways even more. One of the great things that we're all born with is what are called reflexes. There are hundreds and hundreds of these. These are simply built-in behavioral patterns that allow us to engage with the world from the moment we are born, and indeed in some cases earlier. Most prenatal babies in sonograms are seen sucking their thumb or one of their fingers or two of their fingers, so the sucking reflex. But sucking reflex and the rooting reflex, all of these reflexes, some of which we actually lose, but these reflexes, so we don't have to take lessons in sucking, we don't have to take lessons in being startled by a loud noise. No, we come, can I put it this way, pre-programmed to be able to engage in these what are not all just simple behaviors. Sucking is a complicated behavior involving multiple muscle groups and coordinating that with swallowing. This is not just like, oh yeah, big deal. No, these are big deals, and so you'll read about that more in the textbook. Newborns just minutes and sometimes hours old also have a lot of other skills. So for instance, think about this one. If you look at the two images in front of you, the one on the left and the one on the right look very similar, and yet the one on the left is a little bit more like a human face. And indeed, if you put these in front of babies hours old and you hook them up with a device which shows their the amount of time they spend looking at one image, they will look way more at the one on the left. So one of the things newborns are programmed for is attending to anything that looks like vaguely even a human face. And again, think how amazingly adaptive this is. Clearly looking at a human face. And again, if I could put another 2 cents here, babies will look at a feminine face more than a masculine face. Newborn babies do not like beards. So if you're a woman and you got a beard, shave it before your baby's born. And again, that's extremely adaptive because who is likely to keep you alive? Not only a human face, but a female human face. There are hundreds of these things we've learned about and observed. We know that babies will stare at a beautiful face as opposed to an ugly one right after they're born. No, they haven't been socialized yet, by the horrible effects of media and, Cosmopolitan magazine and so on and so forth. We seem to be pre-programmed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things. And again, environment is going to shape those pretty quickly. But we don't start off blank. We are not blank slates. We are amazingly sophisticated human organisms from day one. I'd say from even negative, 50 of day one. So clearly, we don't have time to talk about all those things. Again, we shouldn't have been surprised by all of these things we've discovered over the last 20 years. Because the brain is adding, again, 7,500,000 new cells plus or minus a minute in the second trimester. And again, that's not random. We need to grow a brain. And that brain, once those neurons develop, they are almost immediately begin functioning. And in order to allow those brains to function, they need something to do. And so they're processing information. And again, beginning at birth with the hugely enriched experience that the baby is in, more stuff to taste, more stuff to look at, more stuff to hear. Those neurons are put together now and wiring up in terms of neural connections and neural networks. And again, the simple ones tend to be the first, because think about it, you need to be able to move your arm before you need to be able to, define an isosceles triangle. So the brain stem and the limbic system, the motor and sensory strips, and the cerebral cortex, they're the ones that wire up and develop first. And then it's later on, but certainly in third trimester and in infancy when the association areas, in other words, brain behavioral areas that focus on attention and learning and remembering and memory and language and thinking and all of the things we take for granted as a human being. I don't know, to me this stuff is just quite amazing to look at the process in which our brains turn us in magical ways, in my opinion, into human beings, that you and I just go through our days and take all these things for granted. But it's spectacularly incredible when you think of all the things we had to learn to do and now just do without even thinking. Motor development, again, in infancy begins very simple, being able to lift your head, being able to roll over, being able to, sit without, falling back and clunking your head against the coffee table, then crawling, then holding yourself up, then walking, holding a table, then walking independently. Again, we don't have time to talk about the complicated nature of developmentally of learning how to coordinate muscle movements, to put them together, to be able to just wave, to walk, to crawl. All of these things are complicated. I mean, watch a baby crawling next time. They need to coordinate the way their hands move, with the way their legs move, and again, moving their head. So motor development is systematic. It's developmental in that it's ever increasing in sophistication. Now, there are some environmental things that can affect this. So, for instance, we know that if you are not held and touched and loved and played with developmentally, even if you're getting enough food, you will not, by age 15 months, you will not even be able to stand. So we know there's all kinds of adverse effects that environmental factors can bring to bear. What's really spectacular in terms of development is your brain, the cognitive development, the ability, again, to develop concepts and use them and put those concepts into models of how the world works, to figure out things, to figure out how the world works and how, if you push this button, this will happen, to solve problems. All of us are faced with solving problems, and children are innate problem-solving creatures. To understand, first of all, language, then begin to produce it, use it, communicate, have emotions, understand emotions, self-regulate, self-talk internally, the inner cognitive structure that we use to represent and now the world, and then use those representations to make decisions. Should I eat this or should I eat that? Should I throw my spaghetti on the floor? Should I put it in my mouth? And so on and so forth. Cognitive development is spectacular. Now, we have to talk about two developmental theorists. The first is Jean Piaget, a Swiss developmental psychologist, who, by the way, started off as a marine biologist, and then in watching his daughter grow, became fascinating with the process of day by day, step by step, his daughter being able to use words and say them and move and think, and so he switched over, and the world was changed because of Piaget's approach. Piaget simply said that so much of what we take for granted as adults, we have to learn, and we do this through cause and effect. We do this by building models of how the world works. We see a slide, and then, for instance, it's so funny to see some of these videos, which are available for you to look at in terms of the videos attached to your chapter here. But seeing a miniature slide and trying to slide down it, or being in a car and seeing a car move, and then seeing a small car and trying to get into it. All these things are important because children have to learn that scale. They have to learn that big and small. They have to develop all these capabilities and capacities. And Piaget said we do this in a variety of ways. Now, one of the things we do is he said, is use schemas. Schemas are simply this mental container we use to hold our experiences and our thoughts and impressions. And they take place in interconnected images, models, conceptual networks. And again, instinctively, as parents, we know that we help our children build their schemas by first reading a book about a cow and saying, "That's a cow," and we say it very slowly, "Cow." What does a cow say? Moo. And then when we see an actual cow, maybe at a farm by the side of the road, we get out and we point, "Cow." And the child is able to relate the image in the book with the real thing. And if we're fortunate, the cow goes, "Meow," and the cow goes, "Oh," you know. So even as adults, before Piaget came along, adults instinctively knew that we had to build a child's way of relating and experiencing and internalizing conceptually the world around them. And that's what a schema is. Now, all of our schemas are a little bit different because all of us had a different experience, being 2, being 5, being 6, being 7. Some of us grew up in New York or New Jersey. Others grew up in Paris or Bangkok or Shanghai or Seoul, or Pago Pago in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So some of us grew up with a family, that was one way as opposed to another. Some of us grew up as only children watching a lot of TV. Others grew up as one of 15 watching no television. All of the influences that we had growing up are going to affect our schemas. And so Piaget's brilliance would be basically that your cognitive, the way you look at the world, the way I look at the world, is a function of the development of our schemas. And so he would simply say that every experience affects and changes the schema. Now, how do we do this? Well, through two processes called assimilation and accommodation. The first, assimilate, is basically when we take an experience and we take our pre-existing experience of the world, and then when we look at something new, we try and fit it into our pre-existing experience. So if a baby has had experience with dogs, never seen a cat, and they see a cat, well, a cat kind of looks like a dog, and they'll go doggy. That would be assimilation. Accommodation is what the child has to quickly do because, adults will probably laugh and go, no, not a dog, cat. So accommodation is when I have to change my schema to accommodate a new experience of the world. And we do this back and forth all the time. Let's say that I had experience with yellow apples and red bananas. Yellow bananas, and red apples. And then someone hands me a yellow apple. Now think about this. I can simply expand my category of apple. I can assimilate that into two colors of apples, red ones and yellow ones, right? Or I could simply say there's two kinds of bananas. There's ones that are shaped long and thin, and there's ones that are round. Okay, that would again be another way of assimilation that would be wrong, but sometimes children will get it wrong. That's what makes them so cute. But in that case, what the child would have to do is say, no, I need to accommodate this. I need to create a new category in my schema. There are apples and there are bananas, and they're different. So through a process of assimilation and accommodation, we're constantly changing this process. Now, Piaget said we do this in 4 stages, and I'll let you read about this, but sensory would be birth to 2, pre-operational would be 6 to 7, concrete operation would be 7 to 11, and formal operational would be 12 plus. Now, just a couple of comments on operation. All 3 of the last stages are called something operational. Well, operations are what Piaget's term for kind of what we do in the world, or how we represent what's in the world, our experience in the world, kind of internally in terms of our mind. So if I think of a dog in my mind, it's not the same thing as a dog. My thought of the dog, or my imagining the dog, is a representation, if you will, an operation of the dog itself. And so the pre, concrete, and formal are the different ways in which we can engage in operation. And essentially what you have through these 4 stages is a systematic, growing sophistication of my ability to operate, such that the last one, formal operations, is when I can engage in abstract reasoning. I can think of something that doesn't actually exist. I can imagine planets and unicorns. I can imagine or try and imagine what it would be like to be looking at Victoria Falls in Zambia, Africa, even though I've never been there. If someone said to me it's a monster, huge waterfall, well, I've never seen it. I have no experience of it, and let's say I've never seen a video of it, but I can represent it in our mind. So simply slowly increasing capabilities in terms of my cognitive ability. Now, a second cognitive theorist we have to mention was a Russian named Lev Vygotsky. And again, he was a little earlier than Piaget, but his point of how we grow with our cognitive abilities is simply that we do it through social interactions with others. Now, Piaget wouldn't agree with this, but he would simply say that most cognitive interaction takes place as children socially interact with adults, teachers, parents, older siblings, whoever. And he simply said what most older people do for children is they provide what he called a scaffold. Think of a scaffold around a building. Again, if you walk down the streets of New York, it seems like they're always doing construction and there's always scaffolding surrounding buildings. And again, what does a scaffold do? It provides an outside structure for working on what will be the inside structure of the building itself. And then when the building itself is done, we take the scaffolding down. And so this process of scaffolding, making things simple, slowing down our descriptions, giving simple examples, these are all attempts to scaffold the building. And again, we wouldn't talk to a 16-year-old and say, that's a cow. Or let's say they had never seen an actual leopard. That's a leopard. Can you say leopard? We don't talk like that to a 16-year-old because conceptually we'll just say, oh, that's a leopard. And they're like, well, what's that? Well, it's one of the family of cats, and it's only found in Africa. Because they don't need the scaffolding of going slow. And what does a leopard say? Ah, So intuitively, and again, we can learn how to do this better. We provide the scaffolding, and Vygotsky would have put a lot of emphasis, and I agree with him. If you have good social interactions, if you grow up in a family where there's a lot of communication, a lot of social interaction, which you play, in which you're constantly laughing and being tickled and talked to and read, your brain and your schemas of the world are likely to be much more enriched than if you basically spend your childhood alone, isolated, very little social connection. And again, the world is full of examples of that. So Piaget and Vygotsky, 2 names you absolutely have to know. And again, you can read about those. Now, a couple more things and then we'll be done. I'm not going to talk about adolescence or adult development. You'll just have to read about that. But a couple other things to talk about. First thing is that most children develop what we refer to, or psychologists refer to, as stranger anxiety somewhere around a year old. Some a little earlier, some are later. And again, prior to that time, most babies are not, when strangers are around, they don't cry, they don't start, flipping out and clinging to their parents. Rather, and most parents are a little, concerned about this. No, they're okay. But stranger anxiety relates to the child's increasing sophistication to be able to discern and determine who is familiar and who isn't. In other words, when I am afraid of strangers or anxious about them, I know, hey, that person I don't know, and so it's logical. I don't know you. I should be a little suspicious of you because I don't know you. And so stranger anxiety really speaks to the fact of the ability to of the baby's schema to have 2 categories: people I know and familiar with, people I don't know. And again, it's quite adaptive to be a little suspicious of people you don't know until they prove by their familiarity and by their good behavior that they are not going to hurt you and not going to harm you. Now, we could look at this through evolutionary terms, so I don't think we actually need to, but it's certainly just one of these adaptive things that we have. Just like if a big, a bear comes running at you, growling their teeth, most of us don't need to take lessons in, being fearful of a bear. They're loud, they're threatening, they have big teeth. Most of us, even very young children, can intuitively know. Now, it's not that obvious that strangers are going to hurt you, but it certainly does make a lot of sense. And this brings us to the last thing I want to talk about today, and that's the very important research on attachment. Attachment refers, in infancy or childhood, refers to this emotional connection with another person, usually with a primary caregiver. And again, let's face it, even though we're being politically incorrect here, it's usually the mother of the child. Now, attachment clearly happens with everybody at every age and stage, but the reason why attachment in infancy is so important is because so much research has pointed to the fact that good early secure attachment is hugely beneficial to you, not just as a child, not just as an adolescent, but it will affect pretty much you your entire life. There are reams of studies that show that secure attachment in childhood is highly correlated with, for instance, staying married, whereas insecure attachment is highly correlated with getting divorced. We know that securely attached babies are much more likely to get along with people as teenagers and adults. So attachment seems to have a myriad of potential impacts on later development. One of the earlier studies on attachment that really showed that there was something big going on here was a study done by a guy named Harry Harlow. We used to think that attachment, such as it was really based upon feeding behavior, that animals and human beings, whoever fed you is who you're going to attach to. But Harlow's research showed that it's not feeding so much. He had a bunch of baby rhesus monkeys who he took away from their mothers and made them orphans, and he put them in cages with a wire kind of mother, quote unquote, that fed them, that had a bottle on it, and then a cozy, tactilely comfortable terry cloth covered mother. And the rhesus monkeys basically clung to the cozy mother. And even when they were feeding, they would kind of hold on to the mother. Now, we know that one of the things that we can see, we can do to see if attachment is present, is to scare the baby rhesus monkey or the baby human or any one of us. In other words, if something bad happens to you, let's say you have a bad day, who is it that you want to call? Who is it you want to text? Who is it you want to go find and have a good cry and have them hug you? The research on psychology would say that that person or persons, those are the ones that you're attached to. And indeed, when we scared the baby rhesus monkeys, who did they run to immediately? Not the wire mother that fed them, but the terry cloth mother that provided rich tactile comfort for them. So with regard to the origins of attachment, familiarity, time, connection is pretty important. In other words, that we know in studying animals that there's a window, which we call a critical period, during which they engage in what sociobiologists have called imprinting. And it simply is that the first person, the first object they see, again, baby geese will imprint upon the mother goose. And you can see with this famous picture that guy named Conrad Lorenz was able to get baby geese to follow him around because as soon as they were hatched, he'd be the first face there. As human beings, our attachment is not, it was way more sophisticated. Indeed, there are some babies that are born blind, and so they couldn't imprint in that way in purpose. But it is quite important among human babies for there to be connection. And if I could put a little plug for the absolute importance of breastfeeding for most babies. We could even make, you might consider this an exaggeration, that breastfeeding is probably more important psychologically to a baby's development in terms of attachment than physiologically. We do know, for instance, that when we study mammals, human breast milk is, of all the mammals that exist out there, the most diluted. In other words, it's the most content of water. And why would that be good? Well, if you have a lot of water that's being given in breast milk among human beings and just way fewer nutrients, that means that breastfeeding takes a lot of time. That time of the baby sucking on the mother's breast, the skin-to-skin touching, the eye gazing and contact, the engagement when the baby breaks off breastfeeding, the communicating and talking, all that is really the core of early attachment. Now, attachment can be good, can be bad, and so let's just talk about this. So with regard to looking at attachment, there's a psychologist named Mary Ainsworth, and she's developed what's called the strange situation test. And basically they put a mother and her baby in some unfamiliar room, and the mom sits there and the child just goes around the room, and then a complete stranger enters the room and talks to the mother and approaches the child, and then the mother leaves the room. And then after a few minutes the mother returns. Now what we see clearly here is with babies, they have different reactions, and what most babies, 60% or so, their reaction pretty much is they start to show distress and crying when the mother leaves, and as soon as she comes back, they'll immediately stop crying and crawl to her with relief that they're not alone with the stranger. Now that indicates a secure attachment, and because we can see that the baby has stranger anxiety. We already talked about that. But when the mother leaves, the baby's like, whoa, she left. I want her back. And when she comes back, the response is to immediately move to the mother to reestablish not only visual contact, but tactile contact as well. That pattern, I've worked in daycare centers or in the nursery of my church. And you can see this pattern in infants over and over and over again. They might cry when they're left there, but then they'll get over it and they'll have a good day. But when their parents show up, they're like smiling and immediately moving toward the parent. Now, two kinds of insecure attachment. One is called anxious and one is called avoidant. The anxious child would be the one that clings to the mother. Even when they're in an unfamiliar room, the child won't go off and explore the room. They will not leave the mother. They'll cling to her. And when that person comes in, the stranger comes in, they'll cling to the mother even more. And if the mother tries to leave, they'll cling. They're insecurely attached because they have this sense that, man, I may be abandoned by my mother unless I cling to her. So there's not a healthy sense of self like, hey, my mother's there. I have the freedom to explore this room because I know she's going to be there and I know she's going to come back. No, it's like, I don't know that. I better cling to her. And finally, avoidant style of insecure attachment is, the baby explores the room, the stranger comes in, the mother leaves, the baby's like, okay, whatever. The mother comes in, the baby may look up but doesn't move or toward the mother or show any kind of relief, or it's just like, you're here, fine, you're not, fine, whatever, I don't care. Huge amounts of research show that insecure attachment, regardless of kinds, has long-term consequences. And again, if you think of adults that you've known or friends or family or whatever, you can see this kind of pattern. Clingy adults that are controlling or clingy, or adults that, they're like, okay, you're gone, whatever. If you're around, fine, I'll talk to you. And indeed, so many of our relationships with other people, if you step back and think about it, and I promise you, counselors spend a lot of time counseling adults that had insecure attachments as children, because our attachments as children are the models and paradigm for all of our attachments as adults. And indeed, talk to any marriage and family counselor and they'll tell you that attachment shows up in most marriages. And again, causes problems. Now, it's not that you can't work on these and understand them and fix them, but but you can only do that until you realize. I certainly see in myself the avoidance style of insecure attachment. And again, I was sent off to boarding schools at 6 years of age. I did not spend much time with my parents. 10 months out of the year, I was at a boarding school. And so I certainly can see in my own personality and my own attachment style with my adult relationships a kind of avoidance style. Kind of like, I do things on my own. I'm fine alone. If you're around, fine. But if you're not, whatever. And I've certainly had to work on developing that. Okay, we're done for our lecture today. Just talked a little bit about, I think, the most important aspects of developmental psychology. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.